Okay, so we're moving on to our second and final panel, technology and data building blocks for a methane management program. Our three panelists today have a wealth of experience in managing methane emissions from the US onshore oil and gas industry and beyond. And so expect a rich discussion on how one goes about operationalizing a robust methane management program, including first steps and some challenges that you may encounter. So we've already heard from industry on their experience testing and deploying a methane management program, and then just there from Craig about a type of technology for identifying that sort of first building block that Carl spoke about, identifying the methane leaks in the field. Now we're going to dig a bit deeper into understanding how to operationalize these learnings and develop a robust methane management program. It's my pleasure to introduce the three panelists today. First, Jennifer Stewart. Jennifer is a carbon management strategic policy lead at Gaffney Klein. We also have Matt Harrison, a managing principal at SLR Consulting. And our final panelist today is Jason Lyuberski, the co-founder and CEO of Quotient. Okay, my first question, maybe I'll ask it to you, Jennifer. From your experience at Southwestern before Gaffney Klein to your methane advisory work today, what are some key initial considerations when designing a methane management program, specifically at a smaller company?
Thank you, Andrew. Some of this has already been touched on really well by Carl from CODA, but I would start with conducting a baseline. No matter what, you've got to know what your starting point is to know what improvements you're going to make. And then once you have your baseline, and that's something that can be contracted out fairly easily, once you have your baseline, then explore the technologies that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. In today's commodity environment, you've got to be frugal and you have to be accretive in any of the work you do. So, and it's already been mentioned to some point, the easiest targets are vapor recovery units on the tank batteries, low bleed or no bleed pneumatic controllers, and then of course LDAR, using either in-house or external sources, contractors. And I'm finding that bringing it in-house is fine, and I think we may talk about that a little later, but using that service of doing OGI work is fairly commoditized today, so that it's not that expensive to go to hire a contractor to do it if you're not willing or unable at this time to make an investment in the FLIR cameras that were just previously discussed. And I think, but most importantly, is there has to be a commitment, and this was also discussed, there has to be a commitment all the way across the organization when you start a program to commit to it both financially and with people resources. And so what I mean by that is the field can be committed, but if they don't have the resources from their frontline leadership all the way to the executive leadership to do the work that they need to do, then it doesn't work. And then vice versa, the leadership can be committed, but if that doesn't translate to the field, then what decision is a field operator going to make when they're out, a pumper, whoever it may be, is out on location, they see a situation and they have a decision to make, and they can close their eyes to it and move on, or they can make a call or stop operations or do whatever it is needed to fix the situation, control the leak. If it's a flare, look at the, correct an unlit flare or a flare with low combustion. It's got to be all the way from the bottom to the top. And then so that means, again, the field people, it means your frontline leadership, it means your executive leadership, and then it means your board of directors or your owner managers or member managers. And I'll give an example of just real quickly, when I've been doing some of this work, when you talk to senior leadership, they're, oh yeah, we're fully committed, and we will, and yes, of course we're doing this work. But then when you drill down to the field, it's a very different story, that they're watching pennies so closely that, yeah, headquarters may say this, but what we're doing in the field is something very different.
Yeah, this buy-in from the board all the way down to the boots on the ground seem, I'm really glad that Carl brought that up and
Yeah.
you've echoed the comments. It's just incredibly important. You touched upon, as companies start out, they're sort of considering the trade-offs of doing this stuff in-house or sort of going third party. I wonder if, like, briefly you could go about, like, what are some of the trade-offs that they should consider with this decision?
I think the trade-offs, of course, would be, it's just, sometimes it's just math. Is it always cheaper to go to an external vendor? Is it, is the cost to contract out, is it cheaper than headcount inside? That's always the first metric that needs to be run. And then the other consideration is a contractor going to be as vested in the environmental commitment to environmental stewardship that the in-house would be. And then one thing I wanted to add is that a way to really, really make an effective program from the beginning is build in, once you have a baseline, build in your improvements into compensation metrics, all the way, again, from the field, all the way to your senior leadership. And so external contractors aren't going to be vested in getting a higher bonus or however that compensation metric may be defined than an in-house person would be.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'll move down the line, and next question to Matt Harrison. Matt, what best practices and uses of technology have you seen at small and mid-cap companies as they build, like, their comprehensive methane management strategy? And how did methane detection technology, sort of out with the FLIR camera that we've heard about, how did additional detection technologies play into these early strategies?
Andrew, thanks for the question. When you talk best practices, of course, people think way beyond compliance. When you're talking best practices, there are best ways to comply. And for some companies, that's very important, especially in this environment. And so when you start looking at best practices, what companies have done, as has been mentioned previously, that really starts with the commitment level. In other words, is this just another task that's handed to the EHS staff to say, hey, you're already reporting to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And we're supposed to be complying out in the field with NSPS Quad OA and new and modified sources, are all those reports going? But I'm talking about going to the next level, of course. And usually that starts, as we've found, with assigning at least a dedicated part of a person, and sometimes a person, to managing this task, because the entity can't be visionary and forward-looking without having someone that owns the issue as a whole. So you have to have the champions at the high level, but you also have to have someone that's managing it. And by that, I mean a dedicated employee or pieces of several dedicated employees that are focusing on this issue as a single visionary focus. Now, how do you go beyond compliance once you have that commitment at the top level and the next level? There's a lot of ways to do that, and some have been mentioned by the previous speakers from CODA and et cetera. But if you're just talking, how do you learn about what could be applied, and you're new to it, I think you have to understand the resources, and a lot of that is plugging into things that are already out there. One of the really fun things about the world of methane emissions today is there's so many smart people working on this, that there is a plethora of things for you to look at and get plugged into. And if you said, hey, what are the resources for me to learn about this? One of them might just be going to, how do I get plugged into conferences? How do I get plugged into resource groups so I can learn about it? The other things might just be, well, I want to go research the mitigation options. Then you could plug yourself into EPA Gas Star, Guiding Principles Group, the CCAC group, the IEA Tracker group. Even if you're in Canada, you could have plugged into the Petroleum Technology Alliance Canada and their MRF forum. So it starts with commitment. It's then goes to dedicated employees that have this as a task. And then as far as the, discovering, finding what are the technologies, I think it goes down to what are your peer group doing and how do you get plugged into learning about that. I can comment also, Andrew, on technologies, as has been commented previously. If you go back 100 years ago, the simple technology was what's called today audio, visual, and olfactory, meaning someone walks around and they either see it, smell it, or hear it. And if they didn't find it that way, it might not have been found. The good news is, whereas the refinery and chemical plant industry went through leak detection programs that involved a very labor-intensive method 21 with normally a flame ionization detector or something like that. The upstream industry has been able to skip, for the most part, to the optical gas imaging cameras. And you heard about that from FLIR, and that's been a great boon in terms of speed and efficiency. And you start there, and now you say, what else do I need to do? So I know my inventory that I report to the GHGRP. I do an annual or whatever the periodicity of your required survey is, maybe with an OGI camera, and then now what's your visionary lay on top of that? And there's a bunch of technologies to apply there that we can talk to.
Great, thanks, Matt. And I might come back to you on some of that technology stuff, but before I do, I just want to give Jason a chance to get a word in. Jason, when I worked offshore, a lot of my sort of dealing with data was just writing stuff down with a pencil in my tally book. And maybe I got to use an Excel spreadsheet. What do you see the first steps for a company to take to improve its methane data? Whether that company is right at the beginning of the journey or really quite advanced, because I think the whole suite is like pen and paper all the way to a supercomputer exists at the moment. So maybe you could speak through some of the most practical ways to get on that ladder.
Sure. When I started down this journey towards differentiation, which is really my focus, is turning ESG performance into actual differentiated commodities, a differentiated unit of methane, propane, ethane, butane, and crude oil. It was that focus to stay, outside of regulation, but also complement regulation. And the key to turning things into differentiated commodities that are actually financial instruments is accuracy. So you want to reduce uncertainty, which can be significant in some of the EPA methodologies, and get that as accurate as possible so the buyer has assurance in what they're buying. And so, I've worked from, the super majors all the way down to small independents. And there is a lot you can do with data just right out of the box. I mean, so spreadsheets, don't want to belittle those at all. It's great. It's digital. It's something that can be shared. It's something that can be ingested into things like we do at Quotient to reduce that uncertainty and actually create a differentiated product. But then it also steps into the data that's coming off your existing systems. So that's where we really start, is looking at production level data. So the meters, the flow meters and pressure meters on a well pad, looking at that data a little differently to identify a number of things, but one of which are overpressure events. So catching those intermittent release events, and especially from tanks, batteries, because those are one of the biggest culprits and one of the hardest things to deal with. So in past lives, I've helped develop state-of-the-art vapor recovery systems, and some very practical things you can do there from an operations standpoint is we talked about it as not as a VRU, but a VRS, a vapor recovery system. So you have to design the tank battery and the vapor recovery unit on it, sucking on it in a way to minimize emissions. And we were able to do that by a number of different measures. So a very dynamic compressor that can you ramp up and down based on the dynamics of dumping crude oil into it and having flash gas coming off. but also doing things like taking the thief hatches, which are normally set to about 10 ounces, increasing those to about 18 ounces, which is still below the integrity of the tank. So you have a little bit more time and a little bit more of a pressure boundaries, a little bit wider boundaries to interval to be able to handle those gases without having a release event, and also while not sucking in air. So we were able to develop that in a way that we could send that gas to sales, 95% of the time. And when you did get some oxygen introduced into it, just diverted it to fuel gas. So on over 70 multi-well shale well pads, we didn't have one flare or combustor. So there's things you can do from the O&M standpoint all the way to the data. And then the advantage with the data was you can actually get data off of that vapor recovery system from not only the compressor itself, the RPMs, the screw size, so you have an estimate of throughput there, a simple flow meter on the outlet of that, a pressure sensor on the VRU manifold that is sucking off of all the tanks, to be able to tell with great certainty whether you were overpressured or not, and having a release event. Now, some of that comes into some of those operational characteristics come into, going out and actually monitoring it because of some of the issues outlined by other speakers about pressure relief valves, being faulty or these things. So really having a robust monitoring program with that. But then moving into that data aspect, it then becomes, okay, we're getting data off of all these different flow meters and sensors that exist on a well pad already that has, a lot of times very good fidelity, sub-second, I've dealt with that. But even if you have, a reading every 10 minutes, that can tell you a lot and start to fill in the gaps from the intermittent optical surveys. And so you can start to fuse these data to tell a much broader story and a much more accurate story about what's happening on that well pad. And then that allows you to then monetize it as a differentiated commodity.
And that sounds brilliant, but it sounds like for a company that's just putting together a dedicated resource, such as Matt just described, like this dedicated team is required. Like, what are the real barriers, or what are the difficulties in getting such like a data-driven approach? And like, how should a small company think about doing this?
Yeah, I think, well, it starts with developing an overall digitization and data plan for this. So building off, what do you already have, speaking to baselines and your current equipment that you're using on pad, and what data is available already. And most modern well pads today, even the most simple, say, coal bed methane in Wyoming or the San Juan Basin, have some SCADA instrumentation on it, if it's only the sales meter. So you can actually start to use this data, depending on the characteristics of the whole system, to tell you a lot. So most companies already have that foundation, and then it becomes, okay, how do you migrate from PDFs or handwritten documents to spreadsheets to a database that is collecting these, and then evolve it into the things like we do, which start to get into advanced machine learning and items like that. But it's actually not as hard as it might seem, because a lot of this data exists already, and it's just formalizing it and formalizing those practices.
Great. So we've been down the line, and it sounds like one of the big challenges is getting alignment from board level to boots on the ground. But I was wondering, what other challenges do you three see as companies begin to take their first steps? And maybe you could give me one pertinent challenge each, and an effective strategy that you've seen to address that challenge. And I might give this to Jennifer first, and then we'll go to Matt and Jason.
Thank you. My challenge that I will share is making sure, again, that the panel earlier today and this panel keeps talking about commitment from the organization, and the organization will not be committed if it doesn't understand what's happening. So I can give a real life example of my prior career at Southwestern Energy when our CEO announced in an earnings call that we had a methane intensity rate of 0.056. It was based on EPA factors. It was had to, you know, there's no way to completely test because not all companies disclose that data. But we thought it was the lowest in the United States, and it was in our proxy. It was on the earnings call. It was in the queue. But when you ask the organization what methane intensity was, I would posit that probably 98% of the organization didn't know what methane intensity was, or why it was important, or how it was measured. So the organization needs to understand, here's our starting point, and here's where we're going to go, and here's how we're going to get there. But they also need to understand why. They need to understand why these metrics matter and basically what they mean. And once people understand that methane intensity is just basically a fraction, I mean, it's a very, the calculus to get to that fraction is incredibly complex, but the fraction itself is pretty simple. Then people got it and they understood, and then they were able to be proud and to understand what these metrics meant when they were shared with the investor community and the public.
What are the, additionally to methane intensity, what are the other really key metrics that you've seen to communicate this idea of methane sort of up into the board, like the executive and board level?
So on that point, it becomes a dollars and cents issue. What is hitting the financial statements? What's hitting the income statement? And what's impacting your cash flow? That's what resonates with your CEO and your board. So if you can prove that by beginning a program, just like Carl talked about with CODA, that the amount of gas that goes to sales that was being emitted, the value of that exceeds the cost of new facilities design or replacing components of equipment. That's a pretty easy sell at the beginning. Now, as your results improve, if right now you're emitting a lot of methane to the air, to the atmosphere, that calculus is going to show that it's very accretive. But of course, you would expect that to narrow out over time, so that what you're spending or investing is going to maybe even exceed the amount that's going to sales. That said, it was also brought up that today's environment, no matter what your capital structure is, whether you're public or private, your lenders, your investors, and then the community at large want to know what you're doing with respect to environmental stewardship. And that's the biggest impetus of all.
And how important with this communicating to the broader stakeholders is, like in EDF's Hitting the Mark report, we talk about disclosure of not only the metrics, but sort of some of the methodology behind those metrics.
Yes, and that's where if you have the resources and the time to put together a corporate responsibility report, that's where you lay out, here's everything we're doing, excuse me, to mitigate our methane emissions, and here's how we're measuring it. Transparency is the key to trust from the NGOs like EDF, the credible NGOs like EDF, along with the banks and the investors. For example, I've been on calls where key lending banks in a facility have wanted to talk to the air scientists, because they say, okay, I see these numbers in your corporate responsibility report, but let me see how you got there, and let me understand how you got there. Because the level of sophistication, again, on the capital side is and we saw that with Will Van Loo talking earlier, hiring dedicated ESG leadership. That level of sophistication is now up to par with the industry.
Great. I'll go over to Matt next. Matt, reminder of the question, it's what's a big challenge that you see operators face, and
Sure.
a strategy for dealing with it?
So I'll cast the answer simply to say, your challenge is, how well do you know your emissions inventory, and what are you going to do about it? That's really it. And I'll start with the first part of that. That's kind of two parts. So how well do you know your emissions inventory? Well, naturally, companies know what they're reporting to EPA and maybe to some states, let's say through the reporting programs. Mentioned on here previously, some of the sources are tanks, flares, vents, equipment leaks that we have for the LDAR programs are actually one of the smaller portions of the pie chart of emissions. And there's quite a number of studies out there that look at basin-wide things, looking at, let's say, the EDF Permian map study and others that have looked at mesoscale downwind, which is sometimes called top-down measures, where they've said, hey, we're getting more emissions than people are reporting. So some of that may be due to emissions that you're not expecting to have that aren't part of the reporting program, that have to do with an occasional infrequent abnormal operation or malfunction or something like that, that creates a large emission, maybe even for a short period of time. A tank, a thief hatch left open, a gauge left open, an equalizing line not connected during truck loading, a flare that either has a flame out or has lower efficiency during a high wind period, just as some examples. Now, do you know about those? You know, a company could say, well, what am I doing to know that emissions inventory better? And you could add, as the Hitting the Mark paper suggested, some kind of verification. Maybe that's even an aerial flyover that looks for sources. And now what do you have to root cause those, and what are you going to do about them? Is you'd like to get rid of any emissions that you weren't already reporting. And so we go to the second part of my statement. What are you going to do about it? There is an issue with, let's say you're doing an aerial flyover and you detect something from a certain well pad site. Your trick will be, what are the fixable versus non-fixable emissions? In other words, there are some you expect to have because you're already reporting them and you know about them and you track them. Unburnt methane in a lean burn engine exhaust, or unburnt methane out of flare stack, or natural gas well liquids unloading, or blowdown events, or the amount of gas my pneumatic devices use are all expected. But now you find some that are, what you want to do is find the fixable, actionable item from those additional pieces of work. So again, you've got to know, you've got to say, how well do I know my inventory and how can I improve that? And what are the actionable items that I can take to reduce? Those are the challenges, I think.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, and I think Matt and I work together pondering the question of quantification and really how we get an accurate methane inventory at that level. It's a challenging question that we ask ourselves. Next, Jason, I want to ask you specifically about the vapor recovery systems that you spoke about. And we have a question from the audience about how low can you go in terms of like a flow rate or a small size of a tank battery to make it worth your while putting a vapor recovery system on, and maybe any challenges or hiccups or difficulties with installing an early operation of a vapor recovery system.
Sure. First, I wanted to echo some of Jennifer's comments on, on the return and actually, to your point, putting these equipment and these policies and procedures and methodologies, onto your operations. First, you have to know what's going on. Like how much gas are you flashing off your tanks or your standing losses. With vapor recovery in particular, I've seen on a 6-well pad, the vapor recovery system pay for the entire construction of the well pad facility, which was on the order of about $1.35 million in 3 or 4 months. Especially if you're capturing initial production. So methane reductions and capturing gases from tank batteries included in that. There's not only the reporting aspect of it, but there's the return on that. So in that case, there is a return from capturing those gases versus flaring them, or just venting them. That's top line. Then if you start to talk about differentiation, so monetizing of ESG performance, making your environmental department and sustainability side of the house a profit center versus just a cost, that goes to top line through differentiation and premium pricing, which is a real thing, and we can talk about that later if you want. And then there's also reductions in costs of insurance, costs of capital, that all apply right to the income statement and right to the balance sheet. As far as minimum flows, I haven't been intimately involved in designing those systems for many years, but you can put them on almost anything. And so, they're pressure actuated. So, as the pressure rises up, in the tank or the tank battery, the compressor will ramp up and down to capture those in such a way that you don't introduce oxygen. So it becomes a question of really it comes down to internal policy. So, what do you need to be compliant with Quad O? What do you need to be compliant with your own ESG metrics and goals? And then what's the return on that potentially too? So.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to go that we've got some questions coming in fast from the audience, so I might start moving to those because we've got about 7 minutes left. This one's for the panel, but I have a feeling because of Jennifer's work with Gaffney Klein on flaring, she might be able to take this. But the question is, does the panel have any recommendations on working with midstream gathering companies? It's an issue that's making it difficult to keep gas in the sales line versus flaring, often used, for example, because of high line pressure. So recommendations for working with a midstream gathering company that's struggling with their flaring problems.
Andrew, that's an awesome question, because that was a key element of the EDF Gaffney Klein flaring study was how operational upsets will force a company to flare associated gas. And the key to that from the participants in the study were twofold. One was to invest in your own processing and midstream, and that may not be a palpable decision for, because of the hundreds of millions of dollars that have to be invested in that. So some companies, some larger companies, just took that off the equation and had their own processing and gathering systems. Those that didn't entered into, basically what I heard from all of them was they looked at their gatherers and processors as a partner. A lot of times that relationship is adversarial because there's financial tensions on both sides. So rather than an adversarial partnership, they looked at their gatherers and processors as partners. So when they had their planning for the next year, they would bring their gatherer and processor in and say, okay, here's what's going to sales for the next year. What are you going to do? And how can we align ourselves so that you're investing enough in the infrastructure so that I can get my wells to sales? And at the same time, of course, the midstream company has an IRR it has to meet. So there has to be some trust that what you say you're going to put to sales is actually what you're going to put to sales, because they cannot make that commitment and then you back off on your volumes and then their investment is underwater. So it was very much a notion of, it wasn't a technical answer, it was a people answer of looking at your gatherer as a true business partner and not a vendor that you call on when you need. The other aspect to operational upsets was trying to be very forward looking and trying to anticipate those. At some point you're going to know what the problem is with a compressor. It's not a surprise when a compressor goes down. It's not a surprise when gas line pressures go up. If your midstream, if your partner tells you this is what's going to happen, and then you can maybe adjust your production schedule. So it's very much talking and sitting down and seeing each other's as vested in each other's success and not as adversaries.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I mean, yeah, part of it is like managing your stakeholders and as partners, and another part is like so much of the managing methane is synergist with operational excellence and looking at like if we have less process upsets, a lot of this stuff actually becomes a lot more easier, and some of the sources kind of disappear when we get the operational excellence part under control.
Yeah, there was one example real quick where one of the participants in the study, compressors were going to go down. It was going to take a long time to get them fixed, and they just installed their own compressors, rented and installed their own compressors, just because they couldn't come to grips with their gatherer. And sometimes you just have to take the solution into your own hands.
Great. I think we're almost at the end of the session. I wonder if the panel sort of have any closing remarks based on sort of what they've heard earlier, or anything that I've missed over the last half an hour. Let's start with Matt, and then we'll go to Jason.
Sure. I think, it's hard when you're getting started to say, for someone to come in and give you advice like this is a continuous improvement circle, but you're going to be on that circle at some point. So if you think about how you're doing this, you're assessing and producing your inventory, then you're measuring and verifying, then you are recycling back. And I think whether you're looking at as a company or as an industry, we are all on that loop, and we're trying to figure out, well, what do we know and what we don't know? You'd think after looking at this one issue for 30 years, we would know everything that we needed to know, but we don't yet. And that's why there's still interesting things out there that are good to keep track of. Someone earlier made a mention of Project Astra, which is an effort looking at a continuous monitoring system that could be deployed. The goal being, could you have that instead of cost effectively as a replacement for that's equal cost to doing what you have to do for, let's say, NSPS Quad OA compliance. But now you're able to look at things where you don't have the question of, was there an emission you didn't see because you were taking a snapshot 4 times a year, and these happened in between your snapshots. So I think it's important to think about that continual improvement loop, and it's important to make yourself aware of what we know and what we don't know, and how your process fits into that bigger process.
Great, thanks, Matt. And that's us at time, but Jason, I will give you the final word. So if you have 60 seconds of final thoughts, no pressure, but I'll give it to you.
Sure. No, after working in this space for quite a while, I think there's so much progress to be made that is very easy to do up front, and a big difference can be made. And to look at it not just from a more sales going, more gas or crude going to sales, but there is a market really developing very rapidly, for these differentiated commodities based on their ESG performance. One deal I'm working on now is the replacement of electric utilities' entire gas procurement. So, it's not just a cost center anymore. It's meaningful and it's real, and it's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting, and EDF are definitely watching the differentiated gas market development very, very closely.
And this is Matt, one last thing I want to add. If people are looking for resources for, well, what are my other detection options? There's quite a number of things out there, but one they might look at, even if you're only going to the reference list for it, is the recently released Methane Guiding Principles document. It's a short best practice called Identification, Detection, Measurement, and Quantification. And it doesn't have all the answers, but it links you to all the things that are kind of out there in the world right now. And that's on the Methane Guiding Principles website.
Yeah, we'll be sure to send out resources afterwards. So thank you again, Matt, Jennifer, and Jason, for the great discussion there.